I've been a game warden in the Alaskan wilderness for 11 years now. My jurisdiction covers roughly 12,000 square miles of some of the most remote, unforgiving terrain on the North American continent. A vast expanse of boreal forest, frozen tundra, glacier-fed rivers, and mountains that have never been named because no human has ever bothered to climb them. The scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend unless you've been here, unless you've stood on a ridge at sunrise and watched the land stretch out toward every horizon with no sign of human habitation anywhere. Out here, you're not at the top of the food chain. You're not even close. The grizzlies know it. The wolves know it. The land itself knows it, treating human beings as temporary guests at best and foolish intruders at worst. After what happened last week, I know it too. My name is Marcus Cole. I'm 43 years old, divorced, no kids, and I've spent most of my adult life in places where cell phones don't work, and the nearest hospital is a 2-hour helicopter ride away, assuming the weather cooperates, which in Alaska it usually doesn't. I've tracked poachers through blizzards that would kill an unprepared man in 20 minutes flat, the wind chill dropping temperatures so low that exposed skin freezes in seconds. I've tranquilized rogue grizzlies that had developed a taste for camping coolers and relocated entire wolf packs that got too comfortable around human settlements. I've pulled frozen corpses out of rivers during spring thaw, bodies so preserved by the cold that they looked almost peaceful, and I've delivered death notifications to families who somehow already knew the news before I even opened my mouth. There's something about sudden loss that travels faster than words. I grew up in Fairbanks, son of a bush pilot father who died when his Cessna went down in bad weather when I was 16. They found the wreckage 3 weeks later, scattered across a mountainside in the Brooks Range. My mother was Tlingit, from a small village near Juneau, and after my father's death she raised me with stories of the old ways, the spirits and creatures that inhabited the wild places, the bargains our ancestors made to survive in a land that never really wanted us here. I dismissed most of those stories as a kid, colorful myths from a pre-scientific age, campfire tales that might have meant something once but had no place in the modern world of GPS trackers and satellite phones and rescue helicopters. I thought I'd seen everything this land could throw at a person, every horror that nature could devise, every way a human body could be broken, frozen, drowned, mauled, or simply lost in the endless white until there was nothing left to find. I was so goddamn wrong. It started 8 days ago, on a Tuesday morning cold enough to freeze the moisture in your nostrils with every breath. The thermometer outside the field station read -32 Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that pushed it closer to 50 below. The kind of cold that kills without warning or mercy. The kind that seeps through the best gear money can buy and settles into your bones like a permanent resident who has no intention of ever leaving. I've lived in Alaska my whole life, and that kind of cold still makes me nervous. It should make everyone nervous. I was at the field station in Coldfoot, a tiny outpost on the Dalton Highway that serves as our base of operations for the Central Brooks Range. There's not much to Coldfoot, a truck stop that caters to long-haul drivers heading up to the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, a few weathered buildings that have seen better decades, maybe 30 permanent residents if you count the seasonal workers who come up for pipeline maintenance. But it's the last real outpost of civilization before the road ends and the true wilderness begins. And for game wardens like me, it's home base, such as it is. My partner Derek Tanaka was across the room cleaning his rifle and complaining about the coffee, same as every morning. The coffee was bad. It was always bad, no matter who made it or what brand we bought. But complaining about it had become a ritual, a way to start the day with something normal and familiar. Derek was younger than me, 28 years old, 4 years on the job. He'd grown up in Anchorage, gone to college in the lower 48, and come back to Alaska with the kind of eager enthusiasm that experience hadn't yet managed to grind down. He still believed in the mission, still thought we were making a real difference out here protecting wildlife and keeping people safe. I envied that optimism sometimes. Other times it just made me tired. The radio crackled with static and weather reports from stations across the North Slope. Outside the frost-covered windows, the sun was just starting to peek over the mountains to the east, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold that photographers would travel thousands of miles to capture. In different circumstances, on a different day, it might have been beautiful enough to make me stop and appreciate it. The call came in at 7:42 a.m. A bush pilot named Walt Hendricks was on the frequency, his voice breaking up slightly with distance and atmospheric interference. Walt ran supply drops and occasional tourist flights out of Fairbanks, had been flying these skies longer than I'd been alive. 63 years old, Korean War veteran, the kind of old-school Alaskan who'd survived more close calls than most people have had hot dinners. He'd seen everything from plane crashes to avalanche sites to hikers who'd wandered off marked trails and paid the ultimate price for their overconfidence. He wasn't the type to get rattled easily, which is exactly why the tremor in his voice caught my attention and held it. He was vague on the radio. Bush pilots usually are. They've learned not to commit to anything over an open frequency where anyone might be listening, but he said he'd spotted something strange while flying over the Koyukuk River Valley. A campsite that looked like it had been torn apart. Gear scattered everywhere, tent collapsed, supply bags ripped open and their contents strewn across the snow, and something red in the white that he didn't want to speculate about over the air. "Could be a bear attack," Derek said, setting down his rifle and reaching for his cold weather jacket. "Grizzlies are supposed to be denned up by now, but we've had a warm fall. Some of them might still be active, especially the younger males who didn't pack on enough fat before winter. Wouldn't be the first time." "Could be," I agreed, but something in Walt's voice had set off alarm bells somewhere deep in my skull. I'd known the man for 8 years, trusted him with my life on more than one occasion. He'd seen bear attacks before, plenty of them. He knew what they looked like from the air, how they presented, the patterns of destruction that large predators left behind when they tore through a campsite looking for food. Whatever he'd spotted down there in the Koyukuk Valley, it wasn't that. Or at least, he didn't think it was. And Walt's instincts had kept him alive through 6 decades of flying in some of the most unforgiving airspace on the planet. "Get the gear ready," I told Derek. "Full kit. We're heading out as soon as possible." We loaded up the snowmobiles within the hour, working with the practiced efficiency of men who've done this 100 times before. Emergency supplies in waterproof cases. Comprehensive first aid kit including supplies for treating severe trauma. Satellite phone with fresh batteries. Rifles, mine a .375 H&H Magnum. Derek's a .338 Winchester, both capable of stopping a charging grizzly if it came to that. Enough fuel to get us to the coordinates and back with margin to spare, because running out of gas in the Alaskan wilderness is a death sentence written in ice and wind. The coordinates Walt had given us put the site about 30 miles northeast of Coldfoot, deep in a stretch of wilderness that saw maybe a dozen visitors in a good year. Mostly hunters going after Dall sheep on the high ridges or caribou during the fall migration. It was legal hunting territory, properly permitted and regulated, but remote enough that if something went wrong out there, you were completely and utterly on your own. No roads, no trails, no marked paths of any kind, no other humans for 50 miles in any direction. Just endless white expanses broken by dark patches of spruce forest and the distant silhouettes of mountains that looked like the teeth of some enormous sleeping beast waiting to wake up hungry. It took us 3 hours to reach the site, and every minute of that journey reminded me why this job is not for the faint of heart. The terrain was brutal even by Alaska standards. Frozen rivers we had to cross carefully, testing the ice thickness with every yard we traveled, knowing that a breakthrough could mean death in minutes as the current dragged you under the ice sheet. Steep ridges that forced us to dismount and haul the heavy machines up by hand. muscles screaming in the bitter cold, lungs burning with every breath of frozen air. Long stretches of open tundra where the wind hit us full force and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The world reduced to a white blur that could hide anything. By the time we crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley where Walt had spotted the campsite, the sun was high overhead and the temperature had climbed to a relatively balmy -15. My face was numb despite the insulated balaclava, and my fingers had long since lost feeling inside my thermal gloves despite the chemical hand warmers I'd activated hours ago. I saw the red in the snow before anything else. It was maybe 200 yards from the tree line, in a small clearing that would have been a textbook-perfect spot to make camp, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the surrounding ridges, close to a frozen creek that would provide fresh water in warmer months. Clear sight lines in most directions, important for hunters who wanted to spot approaching game, or more critically, spot approaching predators before they got too close. Someone had done their homework choosing this location, someone who knew what they were doing in the backcountry, not that it had helped them. Someone had set up a professional-grade base camp in that clearing. A four-season tent, the expensive kind rated for extreme cold conditions, with insulated floors and reinforced poles designed to handle heavy snow loads without collapsing. A portable camp stove with multiple fuel canisters, several gear bags in waterproof cases, the kind serious outdoorsmen invest in, a rifle case, high-quality leather and steel, the sort of thing that costs more than most people's monthly rent. All of it was scattered now, strewn across the snow in a wide radius, like a giant hand had reached down from the gray sky and swept everything aside in one violent, contemptuous motion. The tent was collapsed and partially shredded, the expensive fabric torn in long gashes that exposed the insulation beneath. One of the gear bags had been ripped completely open, its contents, clothing, freeze-dried food packets, personal items, scattered across 20 feet of churned-up, bloody snow. And in the center of that chaos, surrounded by a spreading stain of frozen crimson that had turned the pristine white ground into something that looked like a crime scene photograph, was what remained of a human being. "Jesus Christ," Derek whispered. He'd stopped his snowmobile 10 feet back from the edge of the disturbed area and was just sitting there, hands still on the handlebars, staring at the scene before us. Even through his cold-weather gear, I could see his face had gone pale, could see his hands trembling against the rubber grips. He was 28 years old, had been a warden for 4 years, and I knew he'd seen his share of bodies in that time. Drowning victims, hypothermia cases, a couple of bear attacks that had gone very, very badly. But nothing like this. Nothing that could possibly prepare you for this. The man had been skinned. Not partially, not in patches where an animal might have torn at exposed flesh looking for an easy meal. Completely. Totally. Every single inch of skin had been removed from his body with what must have been surgical precision, from the top of his scalp to the soles of his feet. He lay on his back in the snow, arms spread wide like he was trying to make a snow angel, legs together, face pointed up at the empty gray sky with eyes that had frosted over in death, but still somehow managed to convey the absolute horror of his final moments. His mouth was frozen open in a scream that would never end, the muscles of his jaw and face exposed, red and raw and glistening with ice crystals. The underlying muscle tissue was completely visible, preserved by the extreme cold in grotesque detail. I could see the striations in the flesh, the white lines of tendons, the yellowish patches where subcutaneous fat had accumulated before being laid bare to the frozen air. It was like looking at an anatomical diagram from a medical textbook made horrifyingly real. Every structure and fiber exposed that nature had carefully designed to be hidden beneath a protective covering of skin. The skin itself was nowhere to be seen, not lying nearby, not bundled up somewhere in the scattered gear. Whoever, or whatever, had done this had taken it with them. I've seen bear attacks. I've seen what happens when 1,000 pounds of muscle and teeth and claws decides a human being is either a threat or a food source. I've seen wolf attacks, rare as they are, and I've seen what moose can do when they feel cornered or threatened. I once saw the aftermath of a man who'd gotten between a cow and her calf, and it wasn't pretty. I've seen what happens when someone falls through ice and isn't found until spring thaw releases the body. None of it looked like this. Bears tear. They swipe with those massive paws and rip with those teeth, leaving ragged wounds and scattered tissue. Wolves rip and worry at flesh, going for the soft parts first, the belly and the throat. Nature is messy and brutal and chaotic, following no plan except the immediate satisfaction of hunger or the elimination of a perceived threat. But this was methodical, deliberate, precise in a way that spoke of intelligence and intention. The cuts were clean, following the natural contours of the body with almost artistic care. Whoever, whatever had done this had taken their time, had known exactly what they were doing, had treated the human body like a garment to be carefully removed rather than prey to be devoured. "We need to call this in," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back on the snowmobile and ride until I hit pavement and city lights. State troopers, FBI maybe. This isn't a wildlife incident, Derek. This is something else entirely. Derek nodded, still staring at the body with an expression I recognized from my own face in mirrors after particularly bad calls. The expression of a man whose understanding of the world has just been fundamentally challenged. What could do this? What animal could possibly... No animal did this. I forced myself to walk closer to the scene, to observe and document the way I'd been trained, even as my hindbrain was flooding my system with adrenaline and screaming ancient warnings about predators and danger. This was deliberate. This was intentional. This was... I stopped mid-sentence. My boot had nudged something half-buried in the churned-up snow near the collapsed tent, something metallic that glinted dully in the flat winter light. I crouched down, brushing powder aside with my gloved hand, and felt my blood turn colder than the Arctic air. A rifle. Bolt action, high caliber, the kind of serious hardware that experienced hunters brought into grizzly country where your gun might be the only thing standing between you and a violent death. I examined it without touching it, years of training about preserving evidence kicking in even through my shock, and what I saw made absolutely no sense. The rifle was fully loaded. 5 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, safety engaged. The bolt was clean, showing no signs of recent discharge. There was no smell of burned gunpowder, no residue around the chamber, nothing whatsoever to suggest this weapon had been fired in the past week. The man had been attacked, skinned alive, if the frozen expression of agony on his face was any indication, and he'd never even attempted to defend himself. Or he'd never had the chance to. "Derek," I called out, standing up on legs that felt less steady than I would have liked. "Check the perimeter. Look for tracks, signs of struggle, anything that might tell us what direction this attack came from. I need to know what we're dealing with." He nodded, visibly grateful for something to do that didn't involve staring at the body, and moved off toward the tree line with his rifle held ready. I stayed where I was in the center of the destroyed campsite, slowly turning in a circle, trying to piece together a sequence of events that refused to make any kind of logical sense. The victim's wallet was in one of the scattered gear bags, protected in a waterproof pouch along with his hunting license, identification, and emergency contact information. His name was Howard Breslin, 54 years old, home address in Anchorage. His hunting license was current and valid, all permits properly filed, everything exactly as it should be for a legal backcountry hunt. According to our records, he'd signed in at the Coldfoot station 5 days ago. I'd probably been the one to process his paperwork, though I didn't specifically remember him among the dozen or so hunters who'd passed through that week. He'd listed his intended quarry as caribou. Planned duration, 1 week, possibly 10 days. Experienced hunter, multiple previous trips to the Brooks Range over the past decade. Standard profile for a serious outdoorsman with money and time who wanted to test himself against the Alaskan wilderness and bring home a trophy to prove he'd done it. Now he was lying skinless in the snow, and his skin was simply gone, taken by whatever had done this to him. "Marcus!" Derek's voice came from the edge of the clearing, near where the dark spruce trees began their march up the mountainside. Something in his tone made me look up immediately. Tight, controlled. The voice of a man who was working very hard not to let panic take over. "You need to come see this, right now." I found him standing at the boundary between the open snow and the forest, his rifle pointed at nothing, staring down at the snow-covered ground with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. At first, I didn't understand what had rattled him so badly. Then my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing, and I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Tracks. But not any tracks I'd ever seen in 11 years of working this wilderness, in a lifetime of living in Alaska. They were large, significantly larger than a grizzly's prints, which shouldn't have been possible for any animal in North America. The impression in the snow was deep, suggesting considerable weight behind each step. But the shape was completely, utterly wrong. Bipedal. Clearly bipedal, 2 feet, walking upright, alternating left and right in a pattern that was unmistakably the gait of something that walked on 2 legs rather than 4. But the proportions were all wrong. The outline twisted and elongated in ways that made my eyes want to slide away and look at something else. The toes, if that's what they were, ended in points that had dug deep furrows in the frozen ground with each step, like claws or talons. And the spacing between prints suggested a stride length that no human being could possibly achieve, not even running at full sprint. The tracks led directly from the tree line to where the body lay and back again. A straight line. No circling, no stalking pattern, no hesitation. Whatever had made these prints had known exactly where its prey was located and had walked directly to it with absolute confidence. "What the hell makes tracks like that?" Derek whispered, and I could hear the fear underneath the words, the same primal terror I was fighting to keep from overwhelming my own voice. I didn't answer him. I couldn't, because I knew every animal that lived in these mountains, every species of bear, wolf, moose, caribou, wolverine, lynx, fox, and hare. I could identify their tracks in my sleep, had been doing exactly that since I was old enough to walk beside my father in the snow. None of them, not a single species in all of Alaska, made prints like these. None of them walked on 2 legs. None of them had feet that looked almost impossibly, horrifyingly, like elongated human hands with fingers that ended in talons. We called it in using the satellite phone, our voices flat and professional despite the horror show in front of us, and then we waited in the bitter cold for backup that took 4 hours to arrive. The state troopers came by helicopter, the distinctive thump of rotors echoing off the mountain walls long before the aircraft crested the ridge and descended toward our position. They brought a crime scene unit from Fairbanks and a medical examiner who'd clearly drawn the short straw that day. He took one look at the body, turned a shade of green I didn't know human skin could achieve, and spent the next 10 minutes dry heaving behind one of the snowmobiles while his colleagues pretended not to notice. An hour after the troopers arrived, 2 FBI agents flew in from the Anchorage field office. Standard procedure when a death in the wilderness might be a homicide, which this clearly was. They introduced themselves as Special Agents Rivera and Chen, both veterans of violent crime investigations, both projecting the kind of calm professionalism that comes from years of looking at things most people never have to see. But I caught the glances they exchanged when they first saw the body. I saw how Agent Chen's hand trembled slightly as she photographed the scene. Whatever training they'd had, it hadn't prepared them for this. They photographed everything with meticulous thoroughness, collected samples of the frozen blood, tissue fragments, anything that might yield evidence under laboratory analysis, bagged the body, what remained of it, in a heavy-duty transport container for the flight back to the morgue in Fairbanks. They asked us questions we couldn't answer and gave us looks that suggested they thought we were either lying about what we'd found or had collectively lost our minds in the isolation of the wilderness. I understood the impulse. I might have thought the same thing if our positions were reversed. The tracks were photographed extensively, but ultimately dismissed by the investigators. "Probably some kind of hoax," the lead trooper said, a stocky guy named Hansen who'd been working cases in Alaska for 2 decades and thought he'd seen everything the last frontier could throw at him. "Someone messing with the scene before you arrived. Maybe the killer trying to throw us off with some kind of weird signature or calling card. These psychos love their games. Makes them feel special." He said it with the confidence of a man who desperately needed the world to make sense and would bend any evidence until it fit his understanding of how things worked. I recognized the defense mechanism. I'd used it myself plenty of times over the years. When reality presents you with something impossible, the easiest path is to convince yourself you're not really seeing what you're seeing. I didn't argue with him. What would be the point? I'd seen those tracks with my own eyes. I'd measured them, photographed them with my own camera, followed them as far as I dared into the tree line. I'd felt the way something inside me, some ancient prey instinct I didn't know I possessed, had screamed at me to stop when I got too far into those dark woods, to turn back, to not venture any deeper into that silent forest where the wind didn't reach and the light seemed wrong and something was watching from between the trees. But none of that would fit in an official report. None of it would make sense to people who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt what I felt standing at the edge of those woods. So I kept my mouth shut and signed my statement and watched them pack up their equipment and fly away, leaving me and Derek alone in the fading afternoon light with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread that had settled into my chest like a cold stone. "What do we do now?" Derek asked after the helicopter had disappeared over the mountains, the sound of its rotors fading into silence. "Our jobs," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "We patrol, we watch, and we hope to God that whatever did this is long gone and not coming back." It wasn't gone, and it wasn't done. 3 days after we found Howard Breslin, another hunter went missing. James Cahill, 31 years old, software engineer from Seattle who'd decided to take a solo wilderness trip to find himself, or reconnect with nature or whatever people from the lower 48 think they're going to discover in the Alaskan backcountry. He'd registered at Coldfoot a week earlier, all his paperwork in order, heading into the same general area as Breslin. Solo trip, experienced outdoorsman according to his registration form, all the right gear and permits and emergency equipment. When he failed to check in at his scheduled satellite phone time, we organized a search. Standard protocol. Probably just a dead battery or a missed window happens all the time. But after what we'd found 3 days earlier, neither Derek nor I believed that for a second. We found him 12 miles northeast of the first site, in a frozen creek bed at the bottom of a shallow ravine that cut through the tundra like a wound in the land. Same condition, same impossible precision. Skinned completely from head to toe, laid out in the snow with his arms spread wide and his legs together, staring up at the gray Alaskan sky with eyes that had frosted over into clouded marbles. His expression was frozen in a rictus of terror that told me everything I needed to know about how he'd died. His gear was scattered across the ravine floor in the same pattern as before. His rifle, a nice Weatherby Mark V that probably cost more than I made in 2 months, was fully loaded. Never fired. Not a single round discharged. And the tracks were there again. leading from the ridge above, down the steep slope into the ravine, to the body, and then back up the way they came. The same elongated hand-like footprints, the same impossible stride length, the same deliberate, unhesitating path from predator to prey and back again. This time, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I followed them. I told Derek to stay with the body and radio our position to base. Then I started up the ravine wall, my boots slipping on ice-covered rocks, my rifle in my hands, following those tracks into the forest above. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I needed answers badly enough to override my fear. Maybe the not knowing was worse than whatever I might find. Maybe I just wasn't thinking clearly. 3 days of bad sleep and worse nightmares will do that to a person. The forest was different once I passed through the tree line. I noticed it immediately, a wrongness I couldn't quite articulate but could feel in my bones. The wind that had been howling across the open tundra died to absolute stillness as soon as I stepped between the first row of ancient spruce. The light changed, becoming dimmer and grayer, as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary into a different world. A twilight world that existed alongside the one I knew but operated according to different rules. The tracks continued ahead of me, weaving between massive tree trunks, sometimes disappearing where the snow was thin beneath the dense canopy, and then reappearing a few yards later. I followed them for maybe a quarter mile, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps that fogged in the unnaturally still air. Then I found the tree. It was a large spruce, ancient by any measure, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. Nothing unusual at first glance. Just another old tree in an old forest that had been growing here since long before humans first crossed the Bering Land Bridge. But as I got closer, I saw that the bark had been stripped away on one side of the trunk, exposing the pale wood beneath. And carved into that exposed surface, gouged deep into the flesh of the tree itself, was a series of symbols. They weren't any written language I recognized. They weren't native Alaskan pictographs. I'd studied those over the years, learned to identify the major forms used by the Inuit, Yupik, Athabaskan, and Tlingit peoples. These were different, older somehow, more complex. The lines seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them directly, settling into stillness only when I caught them from the corner of my eye. Looking at them made my head ache and my stomach churn with a nausea that had nothing to do with what I'd seen in the ravine below. And at the base of the tree, folded with care and precision like a suit laid out for a special occasion, was Howard Breslin's skin. Complete. Face, hands, torso, everything. Preserved somehow by the cold or by something else I didn't want to think about too carefully. Laid out like a garment waiting to be put on by whoever, or whatever, had removed it from its original owner. I heard movement behind me, not footsteps, something else. Branches creaking in a rhythm that suggested breathing. The displacement of air as something large moved through the trees without quite touching the snow-covered ground. I could feel eyes on me, the weight of attention from something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, so I did. That night, back at the station, I made a phone call I hadn't made in years. My grandmother was in a nursing home in Juneau now, 87 years old, her body failing but her mind still sharp as the winter ice. When I was a child, she'd told me stories about the old ways, about the spirits and creatures that inhabited the wild places of Alaska. I dismissed them then. I wasn't dismissing anything anymore. "Grandmother," I said when she answered, my voice rough from exhaustion and fear. "I need to ask you about something from the old stories. Something that kills people and takes their skins." Silence on the line for a long moment. Then, very quietly, in a voice I barely recognized, "Kushtaka." You've seen signs of the Kushtaka." She told me what they were. Land otter people, she called them. Beings that had existed since before human memory, living in the spaces between water and land, between human and animal, between the living and the dead. They could take many forms. Sometimes they appeared as otters, swimming in the rivers and streams. Sometimes they appeared as people you knew and trusted, using familiar faces to lure victims away from safety. And sometimes they appeared in their true shape, which had no name in any human tongue, because no human language had words for what they really were. "They take the skins," she explained, her voice heavy with the weight of ancestral knowledge, "because they need them, to walk among us, to hunt more of us. A Kushtaka wearing a human skin can pass as human, for a while, long enough to lure more victims into the wild places where they can be taken. How do I stop it? How do I kill it?" "You don't." Her voice was flat, certain, brooking no argument. "The Kushtaka cannot be killed by human weapons. Bullets pass through them. Blades cannot cut them. Fire does not burn them. The old shamans knew protections, rituals, charms, forbidden places, bargains that kept communities safe. But kill them? No. The best you can do is survive. The best you can do is make yourself a difficult target and hope they move on to easier prey. There has to be something I can do. There are people out here, hunters, hikers, tourists, who don't know what they're walking into. I can't just stand by and let this thing keep taking them. There is one way." My grandmother's voice grew heavy with something I couldn't identify. Sadness, perhaps, or resignation. "The Kushtaka are territorial. They have hunting grounds, boundaries they respect and defend. If you can find those boundaries, mark them, keep humans away from the places they claim as their own. They may accept you as a guardian of sorts, someone who helps maintain their territory in exchange for being left alone." "A bargain," I said. "Yes, a bargain. Our ancestors made such agreements in the old days. It's why some villages thrived while others vanished entirely, leaving nothing behind but empty houses and unanswered questions. But Marcus," her voice sharpened with warning, "such bargains always have terms, and they always come with a price." The third victim was a wildlife photographer named Diane Foster, 52 years old, from California, with 20 years of backcountry experience in environments ranging from African savannas to Arctic tundra. She'd come to Alaska to document caribou migration patterns for a nature magazine, had ventured into the Brooks Range with a satellite phone, GPS tracker, personal locator beacon, and more safety equipment than most expeditions twice her size. She knew what she was doing. She'd survived situations that would have killed less experienced people. None of it mattered. We found her 4 days after discovering James Cahill, alerted by her failure to check in with her editor in San Francisco. She was in a small valley about 8 miles from the previous sites, near a frozen waterfall that would have made a stunning photograph in better circumstances. The ice formations caught the weak winter sunlight and scattered it into rainbows, beautiful and pristine and utterly indifferent to the horror that had occurred beneath them. Same condition, same precision. Skinned completely from head to toe, laid out in the snow with her arms spread wide, staring up at the sky with frost-covered eyes. Her camera equipment was scattered across the valley floor, expensive lenses and camera bodies half buried in the snow. Her camera was still hanging around what remained of her neck, the strap cutting into exposed muscle tissue. It was the camera that changed everything. The last 12 photos on that camera had been taken at night, the powerful flash illuminating her campsite in harsh white light against absolute darkness. I scrolled through them on the small LCD screen, my hands trembling despite the cold, and watched as something impossible gradually revealed itself. The first 6 images were normal. Her tent, the frozen waterfall in the background. a pot of food warming on her camp stove. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just a photographer documenting her surroundings as night fell. In the seventh image, something appeared at the edge of the frame, a shape in the darkness just beyond the reach of the camera's flash. Tall, wrong. A suggestion of angles that didn't follow the rules of normal geometry. By the eighth image, it was closer. I could make out more details now. Long limbs bent at impossible angles, joints that seemed to bend in directions human joints couldn't bend. A torso that seemed to shift and shimmer, like shadows given form. It was maybe 20 feet from the camera now, clearly visible in the flash's illumination, clearly advancing toward the woman who was photographing it. The 9th, 10th, and 11th images were motion blurred, the camera swinging wildly as Diane ran or fought or tried desperately to escape. I could make out fragments, snow, trees, glimpses of that impossible shape getting closer in each frame, arms extended, fingers reaching. The 12th image was the last. It showed Diane's face, lit by the flash, eyes wide with a terror beyond anything I'd ever seen in a human expression. Her mouth was open in a scream that the image couldn't capture, but I could somehow hear anyway. And behind her, so close its elongated fingers were almost touching her shoulder, was something my brain absolutely refused to process. Every time I tried to look directly at that part of the photo, my eyes slid away. Some defensive mechanism in my brain refused to let me see it clearly, refused to let me fully register what was there. I've looked at that image 100 times since then, and I still can't describe what I saw. There are some things human minds aren't equipped to perceive. Maybe that's a mercy. I dropped the camera into the snow. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle. Derek was asking what was wrong, what I'd seen, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. I could only stand there in that frozen valley with its beautiful waterfall and its mutilated corpse and the weight of knowledge I could never unknow. 2 weeks after finding Diane Foster, I went back into that forest, alone. I found the tree with its carved symbols again. The skins were gone now, taken for whatever purpose these creatures had for them. But the symbols were still there, still writhing at the edge of my vision, still making my head ache when I tried to look at them directly. I sat down in the snow facing that tree, my rifle across my lap, and I waited. I don't know how long I sat there. Time seemed to work differently in that part of the forest. The light never changed, never brightened or dimmed. The silence was absolute, oppressive, the kind of silence that has weight and presence. But at some point, the quality of that silence changed, became heavier, more watchful, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was no longer alone. "I know you're there," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and small in that vast quiet. "I've seen what you do. I've seen the bodies. I'm not here to fight you. I know I can't. I just want to talk." Silence. But a different kind of silence now. Listening, considering. "This is your territory," I continued, forcing the words out past the fear that wanted to close my throat. "I understand that now. But more people will come. Hunters, tourists, photographers, scientists. They'll keep coming no matter how many you take. That's how humans are. We don't learn from other people's deaths. We always think it won't happen to us." A sound behind me, the creak of something moving through the trees, the displacement of air as something massive passed by, close enough to touch. "Let me help. I'll mark the boundaries of your territory. I'll keep people out, turn them away, make them go somewhere else. You can have your hunting grounds, undisturbed. In exchange, you stop taking people who are under my protection. That's the deal I'm offering." The presence behind me was overwhelming now. Ancient. Inhuman. regarding me with an intelligence that had nothing to do with human thought, evaluating my offer with criteria I couldn't begin to understand. I could feel it considering me the way a human might consider an insect that had suddenly started speaking. Curious, perhaps, but not threatened, not even particularly interested. Then, inside my head, not as words but as an impression of meaning, a concept translated into something my human consciousness could almost grasp. Agreement. Conditional. Temporary. I didn't turn around. I didn't try to see what was behind me. I just sat there, heart pounding, lungs barely remembering to breathe as the presence slowly receded. The forest became just a forest again, cold, dark, empty. The silence became normal silence. Whatever had been there was gone, at least for now. When I finally stood up, my legs barely held me. But I walked out of those woods. I survived. That was 3 months ago. There have been no more skinned bodies since then. No more impossible tracks in the snow. No more hunters vanishing into the wilderness and turning up as anatomical nightmares. The official investigation concluded with, serial killer, unknown, still at large. Recommend avoiding solo travel in affected area. The case is technically still open, but functionally closed. No new evidence, no new leads, no explanation anyone is willing to put in writing. I patrol the boundaries now. Every week, I ride out to the edges of their territory and check the markers I've placed there. Symbols my grandmother taught me, carved into trees and painted on rocks. Old protections that may or may not mean anything to beings that were old when the first humans crossed the ice bridge. I warn people away from certain valleys, certain ridges, certain areas of the forest. I tell them there's been unusual predator activity. I tell them the terrain is unstable. I tell them whatever lies I need to tell to make them go somewhere else. Most listen. Some don't. I can't save everyone. Derek transferred to a desk job in Anchorage last month. Said it was for family reasons. His wife is pregnant, didn't want him in the field anymore. But I know the truth. He'd seen those photos on Diane Foster's camera. He'd stood in that valley and felt what I felt, known what I knew. Some people can carry that kind of knowledge and keep functioning. Some people can't. I don't judge him for leaving. Part of me wishes I could do the same. But someone has to stay. Someone has to keep watch. Someone has to remember the old bargains and make sure the boundaries hold. That's my job now. That's what I've become. If you're ever in Alaska, if you're ever thinking about venturing into the deep wilderness north of the Arctic Circle, I have one piece of advice. Don't. Stay on the marked trails. Stay in the areas where other humans go. Stay where we've worn paths with a century of footsteps. The pristine, untouched places. The wilderness that looks so beautiful in photographs. So pure and unspoiled and inviting. That's not for us. That belongs to something else. Something that was here before the first humans crossed the land bridge, and will be here long after the last human is gone. Something that wears the skins of the people it takes. Something that's always watching from the dark spaces between the trees. Always hungry, always patient, always waiting for the next fool who thinks the wilderness is theirs to conquer. I've seen it. I've made my bargain with it. And every night, when the temperature drops and the forest goes silent and the darkness presses against my windows, I remember that our agreement was conditional, temporary. And I wonder how long I have before it decides I'm worth more to it as a skin than as a gatekeeper.